To the very end of Daf Amid Beis. The Mishnah had said that the oimer is mater grain if it takes root. Now what we're going to have to try to figure out, I'm going to sort of explain until the Mishnah outside, and we'll see it inside. What we have to explain is, where in the pasuk does it say taking root? There's nowhere in the pasuk that it says the oimer is mater if it takes root. Also, it's very strange, because usually grain is like, you have fully ripe, you have a third, which is at least animal fodder. Like, what was it taking roots? It's like, it's the tiniest growth. So basically, the Gemara is going to basically describe it like this. The pasuk describes the barley that's used for the carbon as fully ripe, which implies that what it's mater is less than that. And then the Gemara is going to have to, and there's like three sources where each one is going a little bit less. So it's mater a third, mater less, until we eventually get to growth, roots. Amalei Rav Elazar, Rav Oishia Didarei. To Rav Oishia of his generation, Rav Elazar said to Rav Oishia, "Loi tesev akrecha tefarshel lahos masisa." Don't sit down until you explain to me the Mishnah. What's the Mishnah? Menayin lo oimer shemata b'ashrasha. Where is the source that the oimer is mater grain that takes root? So minalan t'chsiv. It says in the pasuk that the barley that's used for the carbon oimer is oviv. It's ripe, which implies lav mechlal deika de lav aviv, which implies choose the ripe grain for the carbon, but there's non-ripe grain out there that the carbon is going to be matir. So you see, the carbon is matir, unripe grain. Now, unripe grain and seeds taking root is a vast gap. So says the Gemara, de lav aviv lo'olam da'ilo shlish. All you see from the pasuk is that the carbon oimer is matir unripe grain. You do not see from the pasuk that it's matir taking root. Maybe it's matir unripe grain that's a third grown. Who says taking roots? The Gemara says, well, keep going. Elomer Shmuel mehachel chemesh. The pasuk then says that you should use a sickle to cut the standing grain, which implies lav mechlal dika de lav bar chemesh, which implies that there are grain that's not fully standing. It's the same thing. It's just continue in the pasuk. So says the Gemara. So you see from the pasuk that the oimer is matir grain that's not fully standing. Same response though. The lav bar chemesh l'olam shachas. Again, that doesn't tell you taking root. That just tells you not fully developed. Maybe it has to be shachas. Maybe it has to be fit for animal consumption. Shachas is animal fodder. It's unripe, but it's still fit for being fed to animals. So Amar Rav Yitzchak, keep going. Kama, standing grain. Lav mechal de lav bar kama, which implies there's grain that is not yet standing, which means it hasn't even grown to the standing position yet. So says the Gemara, de lav bar kama ul oilam agam. Same problem. That just tells you that it's not even standing yet, but maybe it has to be agam, which means large enough that you could bend it on itself. Meaning maybe it's not standing fully, but it has to be able to be bent on itself. Nowhere is there a source that it's matir with hashrasha bilvad. El Amar Rava asher tizara. The pasuk says that you should sow the seeds, mishas zuriya, which means the second you plant it, it's already matir. It's meaning the pasuk is saying that you should plant the barley, which implies that there's a planting that's significant, and if you plant seeds, the oimer is matir it. Here's the issue though. Amalei of Papa Rava, ihachi afagav deloy hashushu. Wait, if you're telling me that it's matter anything planted, then merely placing it in the ground it should be mutter, even if it did not take root. Where do you see in the word planting that has to take root? Amarle Sudani Tamachacham Basadeksiv. It says Zroya Basada, which means Zroya means placing it in the ground, but Basada means it has to be Mechuber Lekarka. Mechuber Lekarka is Hashrasha. So this is the source that it has to be, that it's mater seeds that are at that stage of the development. It is possible that the Gemara only got to that last conclusion because it whittled down, meaning maybe if you just had Asher Yizara, they would have said, well, only a third developed. Meaning it could be that you had to go through all those stages to get to the point where you realize, no, we've already matered a third, we've already matered standing, we've already matered fodder, we've already matered bendable, and now all you have left is planted in the ground with Hashrasha. New Mishnah, and this Mishnah deals with the following concept, and that is, you are not allowed to harvest grain before the oimer. There's an isser of harvesting grain before the oimer. Forget about eating it. You're not allowed to harvest grain before the oimer. But what our Mishnah is going to talk about is there are situations where you are allowed to. What's the situation you are allowed to? Number one, kaitzin beis hashlachim sheba amokim. You're allowed to harvest irrigated fields. We had this once before, because irrigated fields, the quality is not high enough to be used as the Beis HaMikdash. So because this grain will never be used for the carbon, you could harvest it before the carbon is brought. Meaning, any grain that is good enough to be used as the carbon, you cannot harvest it before. But if it's not chashiv enough, by its very nature, it's a inferior quality, you're allowed to harvest it before. Now, you still can't eat it, but you're allowed to harvest it before the oimer. As the Gemara is going to bring a pasuk. Correct, but that's talking about quality. That must be talking all quality. No, so it's interesting. It is show you, it's interesting that you'd think they would have answered this, but Avaisachais they didn't. It could be because it's livelihood. They didn't want to put their foot down. But but even though you're allowed to cut inferior grain, you're not allowed to stack inferior grain. The Mefarshim explained that stacking takes much more time, and we're afraid when you're stacking it, you'll come to snack on it. So you are allowed to cut, but not stack. Stacking is out. Anshi Yericho, the Jews of Yericho, Kaitzrin, they would harvest grain baratzon chachamim, and the Chazal were okay with this because their grain was inferior, so that was allowed. The Goychin shaloi baratzon chachamim, but when they stacked the grain, that was against the ratzon of Chazal. V'lo michu biyadam, but the Chazal did not give them musar. Interestingly enough, Chazal were not happy with this, but they didn't officially stop them. We'll focus on this in the Gemara. There are situations where Chazal are unhappy about it, but it doesn't warrant enough to stopping. This is one of those examples. Keep going. Other examples where you're allowed to cut grain. Kaitzer l'shachas machal lebehema. You're allowed to cut shachas, which is unripe grain, to feed your animal. So if I have unripe barley, animals eat barley, I have unripe barley, I can cut it, not for me, I'm cutting it to feed my animal. That's allowed before the Omer. Now, what stage of the growth am I allowed to? Omer Rav Yehuda, Emasai, when are you allowed to cut the grain? Bizman shemaschil ad shaloi hevi shlish. If it has not yet reached a third growth. Now, by the way, what this means is, and Rav Shimon Omer, Yiktav yachal af mishehevi shlish. Rav Shimon says, no, you can cut it even though it grew a third. Now, this is very important. Because this is something when you listen to Shiurim, I listened to a couple of Shiurim yesterday. Sometimes Rabbanim don't explain this. The main shaila is, what is considered a maisa of harvesting? Rav Yehuda's shita is, you're only allowed to cut it if it's less than a third growth. Because less than a third growth is not considered a maisa ktsira for this discussion. Once it's a third growth, then it's considered a chashev, a harvest, and you're not allowed to cut it. Rav Shimon says, no, even if it's a third grown, if it's not fully developed, it's not eligible to be brought as a carbon, then you could cut it for your animal. So you have to cut it for your animal, but it's allowed even though it's a third grown. Because it's not considered a Maisa Ktsir because it's underdeveloped. And Chazal will only makel to do it for your animal. Interesting. So, but the Shaila really is what's considered a Maisa Ktsira. Rav Yehuda holds up to a third is not a Maisa Ktsira, more than a third is. Rav Shimon says no, even more than a third is not a Maisa Ktsira if it's unripe. Now this is going to be Negeya. The Gemara is going to take this Shaila and turn it into the laws of Peah, which seemingly have no shaykhis, but there also it's a Shaila of what's a Maisa of harvesting. It's a similar Shaila. No, so Shabbos is different. Shabbos is different. For some reason, you're seeing Shabbos. The significance of Shabbos is that any productive act is considered Isser on Shabbos. Maybe because of by the Mishkan. I'm not sure, but this is not a harvest for this discussion. But I've never seen it apply. Obviously, for Shabbos, it wouldn't apply. There's no Shaila. Now, they do point out, even Rav Shimon holds that if it's fully developed, you can't cut it for your animal. There's no heter for the animal. It's a combo. It's for your animal, so we have Rachmanis, and it's unripe. So put it together. But the shaila is if it reached a third, it's in a maisa of harvesting. That's the shaila. Then the Mishnah continues. There are other situations where you're allowed to cut the grain. Kaitzrim b'pnei netias. Let's say you have saplings growing, right? I'm growing whatever. I'm growing trees. I have a bunch of trees that are growing, and there's grain nearby that's ruining the trees. I can cut them because it's undeveloped, and I'm not doing it. I'm doing it to remove a hezek, so that's not considered an act of harvesting. Also for a house of mourners, the avelim would have a meal. The first meal would be like a public meal type of thing, where the family would eat together, whatever it is. So let's say the only way for them to eat, they're having like a suda, is outside, and they need to sit down, and there's grain there. They could cut the grain to make like a seating area. Beis Avol, Bittel Beis Medrash. Also for Beis Medrash, they want to learn outside. The only place to learn is outside, and the Bachim need to sit down. You can cut the grain. Again, it's sort of like these are because these are not considered productive acts. These are considered like not mechaven. It's like ein mechaven. Okay. Lo yasa oisen krichus. Now, in these cases, when you cut the grain, let's say I'm giving a shear, and I got a heter from the Mishnah, I can cut the grain. So you say to yourself, okay, I'll make them in bundles, and then I'll cut it. No. If you make them in bundles, I don't play a game like that. You cut it, it has to just fall on the floor. You start making bundles, then vice the your kavana is not so just to clear the area. Lo yasa krichos alva menichin tzavasim. Now mitzvah ha'omer lovim min akama. The mitzvah of bringing the carbon omer is from staining the grain. But let's say loy matzah. Let's say by the time we get to this, bring the carbon, all the farmers accidentally already cut their grain, and it's all just cut. So then the halacha is yavim min amrim. B'di'evet, you could bring it from cut grain. B'di'evet, it's not le mitzvah, but b'di'evet, you can bring it from cut grain. Mitzvah so lovim min alach. The mitzvah is to bring barley that's moist, but loy matzah yavish. If you can't find moist, then bring dry. No. Mitzvah so liksa b'layla. The mitzvah is to cut it on the first night of Chol HaMoed. But niksa b'yayim. But if b'di'evet you cut it the morning of the first day of Chol HaMoed, kasher. It's kasher b'di'evet v'daychas haShabbos. Good. Okay. Now, quick point before we address the Anshe Richo is, we said in the Mishnah, you're allowed to harvest irrigated fields because the quality will never be roy for a carbon. Where is there a source in the Torah that you're allowed to cut some grain but not allowed to cut others? So it says the Gemara, Tanya Rav Binyamin Omer, Kosev Echad Omer, is a steer in the pasuk. One pasuk says, "Ukitzartem es kitzira v'havesem es omer." The pasuk says, "You shall reap the harvest and bring the omer." Now this implies that you're allowed to cut the grain. Meaning the pasuk says, "Ukitzartem es kitzira." You're allowed to cut the harvest v'havesem es omer, which implies that there is some grain I'm allowed to cut. But then the other pasuk says, "Reishis kitzirchem alakayin." The other pasuk says the first cutting should be the carbon. So one pasuk implies the first thing you cut is the carbon, nothing before. The other pasuk says, "Ukitzartem is kitzira." You could cut before. So could I cut before or not? So you know what the answer is? It depends the quality. Okay, sad. Mimakam sha'ata maybe. If it's the type of grain from a place that it's roy for the carbon, i'ata kotzer, you're not allowed to. But mimakam shi'ata maybe. But if it's the type of grain from a field that it's efsher for it to be brought as a carbon, i.e., it's the irrigated fields, ata kotzer, that's the heter. So good. So that's how you reconcile the pasuk. So gzeres hakasim. Let me ask you a question. Why can't I have a different option? What if all barley is aser? What was the material that the carbon was brought from? It was barley. So why don't I have a simple answer? The pasuk that says you're not allowed to cut grain is barley. The pasuk says you're allowed to cut grain is wheat, or spelt, or oats. They didn't bring it anyway from the barley. So says the Gemara, Ema mimin shata maybe atakoitzer min shein ata maybe atakoitzer. Much easier solution. So I'll tell you why I can't do that. Hahula masis amrit mid Rav Yechanan. We already reject that yesterday. Rav Yechanan yesterday had a gzeres hakasa from challah that these 5 grains are all the same in these halachos. As we said, because whatever you yotzeh from matzah, you're chayiv and challah. Whatever is chayiv and challah is aser until the omer is mater. So it doesn't matter what material the carbon is brought from. Meaning, there's no way the pasuk would differentiate between wheat and oats and spelt, because the whole point is for these halachos they're all the same. Yes, the barley is what's used as the carbon, but the carbon is mater all 5 types of species, and therefore we're not going to start differentiating in the pasuk, and it makes more sense to leave it like this. Okay. Mishnah said, the Anshe Yericho did something against Chazal, which was they stacked the grain before the Omer was brought, but loy michu biyadam. But Chazal did not give them musar. Here's the issue. Let me just explain it outside. It'll be a lot easier. There's a brisa that says that Rav Meir basically said there were 6 things the Anshe Yericho did. 3 were okay, 3 were not okay. All right. No mention of micha, no mention of giving musar or not giving musar. Rav Meir never talked about whether Chazal gave musar, didn't give musar. That was never what Rav Meir talked about. Rav Meir just talked about, as we'll see in a moment, whether Chazal were happy with what they did. Our Mishnah said that the Anshe Yericho did something against Chazal, the lo michu biyadam. The one who mentioned michu or velo michu, the one who mentioned whether Chazal gave musar or not, was Rav Yehuda, not Rav Meir. So Rav Meir never talked about musar. So obviously our Mishnah was not Rav Meir. It must be Rav Yehuda. Here's the issue. Which fine, that makes sense, because Rav Yehuda is the one who says lo michu biyadam. Perfect. Here's the issue. Rav Yehuda himself said lo michu, that's good, but he said it was beratzon chazal. So the problem is, our Mishnah says, our Mishnah says that the Ketzira was beratzon and the Gedisha was shelo beratzon. The problem is Rav Yehuda, who's the author of our Mishnah, said in a Braisa, the Ketzira and the Gedisha were shelo beratzon. You understand the problem? Meaning, our Mishnah is authored by Rav Yehuda because he's the one who mentions Micha or Velo Micha. He's the one who mentions Musar or no Musar. That's Rav Yehuda's jargon. Rameir never talked about it. So it must be Rav Yehuda. The problem is our Mishnah says Ketzira Ratzon Chazal, Gedisha Shelo B'Ratzon Chazal, that there's a separation between cutting and stacking. Rav Yehuda actually said in that Braisa, Anshe Yericho, Kotzrin Vigochin Shelo B'Ratzon Chazal. So there's a slight discrepancy in Rav Yehuda's Shita. In Rav Yehuda, and our Mishnah seems to say that the Ketzira was beratzon chazal, but in the Brisa he says shelo beratzon chazal. So the Gemara is going to basically say that in the Brisa take out the word Ketzira. Easy. Let's just see it inside. Man shamit le de amar michu v'lo michu. Who's the one who mentions whether Chazal gave musar or not? That's Rav Yehuda. As we'll see in a moment, it's Rav Yehuda, because Rav Meir, when he addresses the Hanhaga of Anshe Yericho, he just mentions whether it was against Chazal's will or not, but not whether they gave musar. The one who mentions Musar is Rav Yehuda. So says the Gemara, V'sav Rav Yehuda, but wait a minute, now we have a discrepancy, because if you're telling me our Mishnah is Rav Yehuda, what does our Mishnah say? Kotzrin beratzon chazal. The problem is, V'sav Rav Yehuda, K'tzir d'Anshe Yericho beratzon chachamava. But that's not true. Rav Yehuda's Shita is in the Braisa that Ketzira is shelo beratzon chazal. So which one was it? Were the Anshe Yericho cutting the grain before the Omer with the Ratzon chazal or not? Now what is this Braisa v'Hatanya? Shisha dvarim Anshe Yericho osin. There are 6 hanhagas. There were 6 practices of the people of Yericho. Shlosha beratzon chachamim, shlosha shelo beratzon chachamim. 3 were in the ratzon of Chazal, and 3 were against the wishes of Chazal. Now, by the way, pause for 1 second. There's a slight issue with this jargon, by the way, for the record. Just I'll mention it now. If I tell you there are 6 things that Gavin does, 3 are good and 3 are bad. So you should ask me. If what he's doing is good, then why is he the only one doing it? Everyone should be doing it. I'm only going to mention you specifically if it's something that you're going against Chazal. Because if you're doing something that's within the Ratzon of Chazal, then, first of all, why are you implying that only Anshe Yericho? Meaning, because Anshe Yericho were the only people who thought of it. So Rav Yehuda is not going to like Rameir's Lashon, because he's saying there's 6 things Anshe Yericho do, 3 are beratzon Chazal. So then why aren't everybody doing it? It must be you're wrong. All 6 are keneged Ratzon Chazal. That's Rav Yehuda's spin on it. But let's go over Meir. What are the 6 things? 3 again beratzon, 3 shelo beratzon. Elu sheberatzon. These are the Ratzon of Chazal. Markivin de kolim kolayom. Kolayom. They would allow grafting palm trees on Erev Pesach. Although Erev Pesach you're not supposed to do malacha, they felt that grafting was not considered a chashuv act of labor. It was very easy, and they were matir in Erev Pesach. The karchen Shema, they would say Shema in the following way. They would say Shema Yisrael Shema Ken Hashem Echad V'Ahavta. No break in between. They would just go straight. Okay, that was the second thing that they did. The kaitzim lefnei aimer, and they would cut the grain before the aimer beratzon chazal. Good, beratzon chachamim. What are the 3 shelo beratzon? The elu shelo beratzon chachamim. Gochin lefnei haomer. They would stack the grain before the Omer. Matir and Gamzio shel hegdish shecholav shel shikma. Their grandparents were makdish carob and sycamore trees, and they would prune it because they felt that when you're makdish a tree, you're only makdish what is growing at the time. What grows later is not hegdish, so they would prune it, which is incorrect. When you're makdish a tree, you're makdish even the future growth. In partzin paratzis begagaseim pardeseim lahachal nasha laniim b'shana b'tzaris b'shabbos v'yomtiv. What they would do is they would open up their fences during the week so that the aniyim could come on Shabbos and take the fruit that fell on the ground. And you'll say, what's the problem with that? Chazal were afraid that if you allow aniyim to come take fruit that fell off the tree, they're going to come to take stuff off of the tree that's still growing. Okay, these are the 6 things. That's where Meir's take. Comes Rav Yehuda, Amle Rav Yehuda, in beratzon chacham hey oisim, you call other meisin kain. If this is beratzon chachamim, then why isn't everybody doing this? So why are you mentioning Anshe Yericho? Ela elu ve'elu shelo beratzon chachamim. Rather, all 6 practices are against Chazal. 3 Chazal gave Musar, 3 they didn't give Musar. So what do you see? if Rav Yehuda is the one who mentions Musar or not, so it's Rav Yehuda, not Rameir. So it's Rav Yehuda. And he says all 6 practices were against Chazal, including the Kaitzrin. So how come in our Mishnah it says Kaitzin beratzin chachamim, when over here he clearly says it's all shelo beratzin chachamim? That's the problem. The Gemara says rather all 6 are shelo beratzin chachamim, al shlosha michu, al shlosha lo michu. 3 they give Musar, 3 they didn't. What are the 6? Elu Shalom Yichu. Number 1 is Markivin Dekalim Kalayom. Again, they would graft Erev Pesach. Number 2 is Karchan Shema. They would reach Shema that way. Number 3 is Kaitzrin V'Goitchin. By the way, Kaitzrin V'Goitchin are 3 and 4. Kaitzrin V'Goitchin Lifnei HaOmer. What's up, Danny? Kaitzrin V'Goitchin Lifnei HaOmer. They would cut and graft before the Omer. Ve'elu Shemichu B'Yadam. Go to the next page. And these are the ones that they would give Musar. Matirin Gamzia Shel Hegdish Shechal V'Shechikma. They would prune the carob and sycamore trees that were hegdish. Number 6 is partzin puratzayis begagesayim pardesayim. They would open up. They would open up. What do you call it? The pathway for the aniyim to come on Shabbos to take the fruit. V'noisin pei liyarek, and they would separate pei from vegetables, which is not required. Pei is only from fruit, not vegetables. So the question is, over here in the Braisa, Rav Yehuda says the Kaitzin was Shaloi Beratzin Chazal. You know, it's also the problem. I said there were 6 things. I just counted 7. I counted 7 as I did it. So is it 6 or 7? So it says the Gemara, V'lutamech Shisha Shiva Hava Elosami Mikan Ketzira. Take out the word Ketzira from here, and then it answers both questions. It's only 6, and it's no longer an issue because he didn't address Ketzira in the Braisa. Okay. What we have to do now, again until the end of the Amid, we do this fairly quickly, is the fundamental shayla like this. In our Mishnah, we had a shayla, are you able to cut unripe grain for your animal? So the Mishnah said yes, because it's not considered an act of harvest. The shayla is, though, at what stage in the growth is it considered a problem? At what stage in the growth? Rabbi Yehuda said only up to a third. Above a third is a maisa of harvest. Or Shimon says no, even above a third is not a maisa harvest. So Shimon says, even above a third is not a maisa of harvesting. The Gemara says, the same exact shaila is revolving the laws of Peah. Now what is the shaila? Let me explain like this. I have a giant field. Peah means separating one corner. What makes it one field as opposed to 2 fields where you have to separate 2 corners worth? So says the Gemara, Tanan Hasan is a Mishnah in Peah. These things make separations, dividing a field into 2 fields, which will require 2 payas. What makes a dividing line? Hanachal, a ravine. Hashlulis, a pond. Derech hayachiv harabim, a road. V'shvil harabim shel hayachid, a public path or a private path. Moisacham, moisachasham, both during the rain season and the summer season. V'habar, a pit. V'hanir, a plowed field. V'zera'achar, a different type of seed, meaning if in the middle of my field I have a different type of growth, then obviously the 2 separate fields. Now here's the thing. This line is all that matters. V'koitzer l'shachas mafsik divrei Rav Meir. Rav Meir says, if I have a giant field and I cut a path in the middle of unripe grain, that itself separates the 2 fields. Now here's the point. You'll say, what does that have to do with anything? Let me explain why. I see Gavin, he has a giant field, and he cuts it down the center, unripe grain. It's not ripe. He cuts unripe grain, a giant, like a little shaved in the middle. There's 2 ways to look at what he did. You could look at what he did as an act of harvesting, and you'll say, well, when are you cutting the rest? In 6 months and 8 months. But this was an act of harvest. This is the first act of harvest that will be completed in 6 months from now. But it's really one field. Or no, it's not an act of harvest. Rather, it's a dividing line. If it's an act of harvest, this is where it's a little bit tricky. If it's an act of harvest, then this is the first of the acts of harvest that will harvest this entire field. Now maybe you're doing it in stages, maybe the stages are 6 months apart, but it's a maisa of harvest. Rav Meir says, no, it's not a maisa of harvest. It's not harvest, it's unripe. If it's unripe, it's not a maisa of harvest. So what is it? It's a dividing line. Because if it's a maisa of harvest, then you're just harvesting the field. Most people do it at once. You're crazy, you do it over time. No. Says Rav Meir, no, it's not a maisa of harvest, it's unripe. So you see that Rav Meir is similar to Rav Shimon in our Mishnah. Now we assume, making an assumption, that Rav Meir is talking about it's already grown a third. It's still not a maisa of harvest. it's just a bald spot in the field separating the two. It's already reached a third. It's not a Ma'aseh of harvest. And Rav Shimon holds like Rav Meir. Rav Meir holds like Rav Shimon in our Mishnah, that even if it reaches a third, again, Rav Yehuda holds it's only not a Ma'aseh of harvest until a third. Rav Shimon holds it's not a Ma'aseh of harvest even above a third. We assume that Rav Meir is talking about it already reached a third, which means it's not a Ma'aseh of harvest. Rav Meir holds like Rav Shimon. Says the Gemara, the Chum say no, ein mafsik elim kein charish. The Chum say no, merely harvesting the grain is not going to make a bald spot because that's just a Ma'aseh of harvest, and it's just one part of the stages of harvesting the field. Unless you also thresh the area, that's a bald spot. That separates the field, but that's considered a Ma'aseh of harvest. Rav Meir says it's not, and we assume it's already reached a third. So you see that it's already reached a third. Rav Meir holds like Rav Shimon that it reaches a third is not a Ma'aseh of harvest. So the Gemara speaks it out. Amar Abrachan Rav Yechanan, Rav Meir b'shitas Rav Shimon Amra, the Amar Yaktir v'Yachal Amar Shevi Shlish, Amar Kasavar Kol Shachas Lav Ksirahi, because we make an assumption that Rav Meir was talking about it already reached a third. When Rav Meir said, all Rav Meir said is that it's not a Ma'aseh of harvest. In our Mishnah, we had a machlokes. Rav Yehuda says it's not a Ma'aseh of harvest until a third. Rav Shimon says even above a third. We assume that Rav Meir is talking about it reached a third, and it's not a Ma'aseh of harvest like Rav Shimon. Says the Gemara, Yosef Rava Karmel Hashmaita, Eser Racha Bar Huna L'Rava. Wait a minute, you're telling me that according to Rav Meir, it's not a Ma'aseh of harvest, even if it reached a third. But wait a minute, what does the Brisa then say? Achal Chagav, let's say locusts devoured a strip in the field, or Kirsumin Nemalim, or ants cut it, or Shivrate Haruach, or the wind broke it. Hakol Moedim, even Rav Meir, who said that it's not a Ma'aseh of harvest, considered Charish Mafsik, like Charish Ein Mafsik. Even Rav Meir holds that who says that it's normally, it divides the field, meaning Rav Meir holds that it's not a Ma'aseh of harvest and it divides the field, but he does say though that if it wasn't done by man, if it was done by locusts, whatever, then the field is then charash mafsik, eina charash eina mafsik. If you did not subsequently plow it, it does not divide the field into two parts. Meaning, although Rav Meir, this is where it's tricky, a Ma'aseh of harvest does not separate the field. Not a Ma'aseh of harvest separates the field. Rav Meir believes it's not a Ma'aseh of harvest and it separates the field. But says the Gemara, Rav Meir is moida. If it was not done by man, then it does not separate the field. Says the Gemara, Hakol moida man Rav Meir. So wait a minute. So I amrit b'shloim masisim b'shloi hevi shlish brayse the charishin loy charish loy b'shehevi shlish Eli yamrit masisim nam b'shehevi shlish hashnu ma'hasim de ktsira de adam am Rav Meir loy shema ktsira hachalei kol shekain. Basically, it's like this. Rav Meir said that if I cut down the middle, it's not considered a Ma'aseh of harvest, and it's considered two separate fields. But if grasshoppers did it, it's one field. I don't understand that. It doesn't make any sense. If I do a Ma'aseh, and it's still, if I do a Ma'aseh, and it's considered not a Ma'aseh of harvest, then by grasshoppers doing it is a Ma'aseh of harvest? Of course not. So how do you reconcile this? So if Rav Meir was talking about less than a third, so then it makes sense. Rav Meir is talking about less than a third. The case of the grasshoppers is where it reached a third. Okay, so it's not talking about the same case. But if you're telling me Rav Meir was also talking about reaching a third, and he holds like Rav Shimon, that it's not a Ma'aseh of harvest even to reach a third, then how do you reconcile these two cases? So says the Gemara, you're right. Rav Meir doesn't hold like Rav Shimon, he holds like Rav Yehuda. Again, Rav Yehuda holds, all Rav Meir said is that if I harvest it and it's unripe, it's not a Ma'aseh of harvest. We thought he was talking about a reach a third like Rav Shimon, and we say, no, it's not a reach a third, he holds like Rav Yehuda. That only until a third is it not Ma'aseh harvest, like Rav Yehuda. Okay. Says the Gemara, El Rav Meir b'shitas Rav Yehuda Amar, the Amar emasan bezman shehischal ad shalei hevi shlish, av mehischal shehevi shlish aser. Okay. Here's the problem. The problem is like this. You're telling me that Rav Meir holds like Rav Yehuda. Again, what did Rav Yehuda say? Rav Yehuda said that you can harvest unripe grain for your animal if it's under a third. Rav Meir also said you're harvesting unripe is not a Ma'aseh harvest. They're both saying the same thing. Under a third, perfect. Only difference is Rav Yehuda was talking about where you're harvesting it for an animal. Rav Meir was talking about where you're harvesting it for yourself. So I don't know if Rav Yehuda would agree with Rav Meir. All Rav Yehuda said is that if it's unripe third, it's not a Ma'aseh of harvest. But he was talking about harvesting it for your animal. I don't know what Rav Yehuda would say, whether Rav Yehuda would agree with Rav Meir. Says the Gemara, when you're harvesting for an animal, did Rav Yehuda say the same thing when you're harvesting for a person? Because if that would be the case, if Rav Yehuda Taka said his shita, even harvesting for people, then it would be a third shita in the Mishnah. The Mishnah was talking about animals specifically. So the Gemara says, you know what? You're right. Rav Meir doesn't hold like Rav Yehuda. He doesn't hold like Rav Shimon. Again, Rav Meir's shita is that if I harvest it and it's unripe, it's not a Ma'aseh of harvest. Therefore, the the field is divided. We want to know who he holds like. So we thought at first, he's talking about a third, he holds like Rav Shimon. The Gemara says no. Maybe he's saying it's less than a third, he holds like Rav Yehuda. Also no, because Rav Yehuda was only talking about harvesting for an animal, not harvesting for a person. You know what the answer is? Rav Meir holds like Rav Akiva. As we'll see in a moment, Rav Akiva's shita is that if you harvest and it's unripe under a third, even if you harvest for a person, it's not considered a ma'aser of harvest. Says the Gemara, El Kiyasa Rav Dimi Amar Rav Meir B'shitas Rav Akiva Rabbi. Rav Meir followed his Rabbi Rav Akiva. The Amar Afla Adam Nami, that he said that even if you harvest unripe grain for a person, if it's not a third, lo yahave katsira, it's not considered an act of harvesting. Titnan, as the Mishnah says, Hamenamer Sada, if you harvest a field in patches, V'shayir by klachem lachem, so I'm cutting like in rows. Rav Akiva Omer, Peya l'cholechad ve'echad. Rav Akiva, again, the rule is, if it's a ma'aser of harvest, then it's one giant field done in stages. If it's not a ma'aser of harvest, then you're making separate fields. Rav Akiva says, if you cut the field into patches and it's unripe, even if you're cutting it for people, it's not considered a ma'aser of harvest, and it's multiple fields, and you have to separate peya from each strip. Chum say, no, this is a ma'aser of harvest, you're just harvesting it slowly in a weird way, but it's one field, only one peya. Rav Akiva only felt that it's not a ma'aser of harvest if it's unripe, even for people, if you're doing it for toasted grain, which are made of grain that's under a third. Because since it's under a third, it's not considered ma'aser of harvest. But if you're harvesting in order to put it into a storage house, which is done with fully ripe grain, then it's not considered dividing the field, meaning when you're harvesting it fully ripe, yeah, but if you're harvesting it fully ripe, then it's obviously considered a ma'aser of harvest. Hold on 1 second. Meaning it's unripe, it's under a third, but if you're harvesting it for the intention to put it into a storage house to fully mature, then it's considered a ma'aser of harvest. So Rav Meir holds like his Rebbe, Rav Akiva, that if it's under a third, even if it's done for people, it's not considered a ma'aser of harvest. Now Rav Akiva is mechalik under a third if you're doing it to eat it at that stage or to let it fully develop. If it's to let it fully develop, it is a ma'aser harvest, but to eat it at this stage is not a ma'aser harvest, even if it's done being by people. And Rav Meir holds like Rav Akiva. The Gemara just ends off, Eini, is this true? V'kiyasa Rav and Amar Rav Yochanan mechayev ha-Rav Meir af mechayev ha-Rav Akiva af menamar l'oitzer. But didn't Rav Yochanan say that Rav Akiva holds that there is no distinction? Meaning, according to Rav Yochanan, Rav Akiva holds that even if you cut it with the intention to fully ripen it, it's considered a problem. It's not considered even if you cut it, if it's under a third, with the intention to have it fully ripen, it's not considered a ma'aser of harvest, and that's not like Rav Meir. That Rav Meir definitely doesn't hold like. Rav Meir holds that it's only okay if it's meant to be eaten at this stage, which is the first version of Rav Akiva. The second version of Rav Akiva is that you're allowed to cut it under a third, even if it's to hold on to it till later, and it's not a ma'aser of harvest. So that Rav Meir does not agree with Rav Akiva, and the Gemara responds, Rav Meir agrees in principle with Rav Akiva, but that nekuda he maybe disagrees with.